I'd never been in a scenario where there were so many aircraft that we could get separated and I could randomly. There was another Strike Eagle that for whatever reason was alone and had the right, color painted up on the tail, and I would say that there was probably quite a few lessons like that this laboratory allowed me to experience. And, so I kind of get the whole idea of being exposed to that sort of high intense environment, it toughens you up. It certainly increases your chances of success later on.
That's the obvious question, isn't it? So you went, and again, we'll do a dedicated podcast on it, so don't feel like you have to go into too much detail. But you went to Iraq in March 2003. You were part of the fighting or the shooting war, as it was, euphemistically called. Did you sort of at that time reflect on your red flag experience and think
red flag was harder than real combat? I can say that unequivocally. Right. I mean, outside of the threat of actually being shot down, and those moments of terror that you get when you realize that your life is actually in danger. Outside of that, in terms of the chaos and the fog of war and the all of the things that are happening at the same time, I distinctly remember thinking, red flag was harder than this. And on the flip side of that, especially as, again, I went to red flag as a new guy, there were a lot of things that happened there that also made me a lot more confident. I mean, on one hand, getting separated from my flight lead, it seems like a minor kind of stupid thing, but it really reminded me that the whole fog of war concept, I mean, it's really chaos. Even when you have these very intricately planned missions and you have specific places to be at specific times at specific altitudes, and you have all these tactics and things that, even based in all of that, the whole idea about you plan with a micrometer and you execute with a chainsaw, it really sort of reinforced that. But on the same way, you get to go, you get to fly against simulators of SAMs, very, very highly fidelity simulators of SAMs, and it validates these tactics that you read about. I mean, when you're in training, they say, okay, you move the jet this way, do a glib 2, do a level S, and there's never any real world feedback. And, I guess I was kind of ambivalent about it. But at Red Flag, they have a camera that's mounted to the SAM site, and there's you in the camera, and they show this in front of the entire Red Flag debriefing room, for a couple hundred people. And, it shows the, radar lock or whatever, and it shows your maneuvering. And you can see yourself executing these tactics, and you can see how those tactics actually work against a great SAM operator in a very high fidelity simulator. So that to me produced a very high level of confidence that, I know it seems stupid, but that the people that wrote the tactics know what they're talking about. And so again, fast forwarding to getting in real combat, it set kind of in my mind that the path to success was to do what I was trained to do. And again, sounds stupid, but there's, for me, especially at the very beginning, being in real combat and seeing AAA and SAMs go off and things like that, it's terrifying. It really sort of puts you off balance. I've had moments where I was like quite literally paralyzed by fear. And then the way out of that is, okay, do what you're trained to do, fall back on that training. And that's quite closely interlinked to seeing in real world practice that those tactics do actually work.
How many hours or how much time had you spent with the rockets then when you deployed? I mean,
I think I had about 700 hours, which it's not really a lot of time.
But that's 700 hours total time, right? You're not talking about 700 hours in the Strike Eagle.
No, I think it was about 700 hours in Strike Eagle time.
So were you comfortable at that point? A couple of times in the conversation earlier, you talked about, you could fly a T-38 or you could fly a Strike Eagle, but you weren't comfortable doing it. You didn't really know what you were doing. And
that's still the case today.
But people talk about HOTAS in the same way, and that's maybe part of that conversation. Someone said to me, even for something like the Eagle, which is not as complex as maybe the Viper, it's 300 hours or so to get comfortable.
That's fairly accurate. Yeah. And by my recollection, I think that was sort of a typical annual flying amount was about 300 hours.
So a year or so of flying the airplane, and you should be starting to feel comfortable.
I think that's true. And again, the numbers are kind of failing me right now, but I think it was 300 hours that was required for you to upgrade to flight lead, and that roughly translated up to about a year's experience in the squadron. And so when I, basically as a 700-hour pilot, when I went to Iraq, I was a very different pilot, than I was when I first showed up. Qualification-wise, I was a 4-ship flight lead. I had done a couple of rides of instructor upgrade, although I hadn't completed it at the time that I went off. So, I was much more comfortable both in the airplane and obviously being a tactical leader of other airplanes at the time. I had no experience being shot at that point, which strangely enough is a interesting experience of its own. But I was certainly as comfortable in the airplane as I have ever been in the airplane. And I would argue even at that point that I was probably more comfortable in the airplane then than I ever was at any other point in my career, even after I went back to the Strike Eagle the second time.
So that's an interesting rabbit hole to go down. And again, from my general aviation experience, I remember instructors saying to me that for civilian flying, there's a point at about the 300, 400 hour mark where you become complacent. You're
most dangerous.
You're quite likely to have an accident. And for military pilots, they said to me, because my CFI, when I learned to fly helicopters, was an ex-Royal Navy test pilot. He said it's 1,000 hours for military pilots. That's typically.
I think that's probably true.
So is that a reflection of that? The fact that you felt most comfortable then at any point before or after? Does that sort of?
Well, there's certainly a component of, I think, my self-awareness as an aviator on my second tour. I knew what I didn't know, and I would even say that. Today, I will jokingly tell people that I know less today than I ever have at any point in my aviation career. And that's not a quantity or experience argument. That is, I know more is out there that I don't know, right? So the quantity of unknowns is larger than it was in the past. So, and obviously, aviators are always learning. Yeah, I think that's a fairly accurate assessment. It was a question of combination of, I guess, proficiency at that point. I'd done a lot of flying. The hourly requirements for annual training were still relatively high. The budgets had a lot of flying in them, and it was the first time I had learned these things. So these were fresh lessons to me. Again, certainly I hadn't done any combat deployments before that time, so I didn't have the kind of cocksureness that the combat veterans had. One of the things, just very quickly, on a a very early combat mission, it wasn't the very first night that I flew, but it was maybe my second or third flight in. I was in a 4-ship formation. I was the number 3 of the 4-ship, leaving the tanker in northern Saudi Arabia and heading north toward Baghdad. And since it had just started to get dark, and it used to be that the E model required some filters to be placed in the cockpit so that you could be on NVGs. So it took sort of 5 or 10 minutes to kind of open up this kit, and while the airplane's on autopilot or the backseater's flying or whatever, you're setting up the cockpit. And then once it's all set, then you put the goggles on and you click them down. And when I clicked them down, way off in the distance, I could see sort of the Baghdad area, and it looked like a fucking maelstrom, man. Like there was just like everything was black except this one area where there was just fire and ice, and that was one of those frozen with fear moments. Like I was, holy shit. And right in the middle of that, my flight lead, who had been he was an 05 at the time, and he had been a veteran of Baltic War, kind of Yugoslavia, Serbia. He got on the radio, and his comment was, "Here they come, boys." And it was like, I know it sounds stupid, and it was kind of, just an offhand comment, but he was so calm and so cool. And I was like, all right, if he's that cool, I can be that cool. I mean, if he's that confident that, tighten your seatbelt down, man, it's about to get good, that gave me a lot of confidence too. So I didn't have quite the same, I guess, aptitude or whatever of guys that had been there before. Maybe my apprehension level, made me pay attention a little bit more, because certainly, as we can talk about later, but my later on, weeks later, I was very desensitized to these startling things where, I would see surface-to-air missile launches and just sort of casually talk about it, and I would know in the first 5 seconds whether it was coming my way, and if it wasn't coming my way, fuck it, I don't need to pay attention to it. Where early on, I'm watching everything like a hawk and making sure that it's not coming at me, because it feels like all of it. And that's what these guys who were already combat vets, they'd already sort of learned those lessons, and I'm guessing at least externally they gave the appearance of being desensitized to that.
I think it was Robin Olds, wasn't it, who said that fear is a natural thing. There's nothing to be ashamed in.
Right.
That the real skill is taking that and turning it into an action,
for sure,
into some kind of positive energy. Do you then? I know that you shouldn't compare wars, but in Southeast Asia, those guys were having people shot down all the time. the numbers were just ridiculous, and to do 100 missions was extraordinary.
Right.
Not quite the same Southwest
No,
Asia, not
certainly
quite
not.
the same in Iraq, but
No.
you did lose people. There was
We
one
did.
strike eagle shot down. I think Salty Watkins and Das
That's right.
Boot,
And may have been shot down, may have been, so that's undetermined,
Special
but
D,
but
maybe.
it very well could have been a shoot down.
Yeah.
They didn't rule that out.
But did do you get, does that breed complacency? Well, and it's the same with 1991. The simulations said we're going to lose a bunch of people on the first night, and then it didn't happen. Were you going into that thinking we're going to lose 30%, and at the end of week 4 you hadn't, so now you're a bit cocky about it?
Perhaps. I will tell you from a personal perspective, I tried to block all that out. I definitely had the it's not going to happen to me, kind of thought. Like if you sit around and dwell on, I might get shot down, you're going to be unable to function. So I just didn't think about it. As stupid as that sounds, I didn't think about it. And it's not until certain things happen that sort of snap you back to reality.
If you enjoyed this clip and want more, you can go to 10percenttrue.com, hit subscribe, you get early ad-free access to all my content. Appreciate your support.